The morning of November 3rd, 1884, broke bitter and gray across the Teton Valley. Clarence Vance stood on the wooden porch of his bank, stamping his feet against the cold, and watched the sky darken to the color of wet slate. His breath came out in white plumes, and he clutched his coat collar tighter, cursing the frontier weather as he cursed nearly everything else about this rough country. But Vance was not thinking about the cold. He was thinking about 300 acres of prime river bottomland, property that had belonged to the Holbrook family until 6 months ago, when the last of them, old Henry Holbrook himself, had died of pneumonia in his cabin. The land should have passed immediately into Vance's careful financial hands through a debt Holbrook could never have repaid. Should have. But instead, a slip of a girl had returned from the city where she'd been working as a governess, and with her return, all of Vance's plans had begun to unravel like a cheap thread. Margaret Elise Holbrook was not the sort of woman Vance typically encountered in his dealings. She did not weep, did not falter, did not beg. When he had presented himself at her door with his ledgers and his foreclosure papers, she had listened to him with those strange green eyes of hers, eyes that seemed to look right through his expensive waistcoat and see something that made her lips curve upward in what could charitably be called amusement. She had politely refused him. Politely, but with a firmness that suggested she would sooner burn the cabin to the ground than let him have it. In the months since, she had vanished into the rocky country to the north, and local gossip suggested she was doing something with the caves that riddled the limestone cliffs above Dry Creek. Vance had not bothered to investigate. He was a banker, not a spelunker. He had assumed her efforts would fail, as the efforts of a woman alone must inevitably fail. He had assumed time would be his ally. He had assumed very little that autumn would come to pass. But now, standing on his porch, watching that dark sky, Vance felt something shift in his certainty. His bank had received an order for salt 3 weeks prior, an unusual order placed by the town's supply agent with an unusual caveat. Payment guaranteed by Miss Maggie Holbrook herself, at a price per pound that was, frankly, remarkable. The supply agent had executed it, having little reason not to. And now the autumn rains were coming. Ixtlan would come heavy and early, and the pass would close, and by the time spring came again, Vance's carefully laid plans would be 6 months older still. He did not like to be thwarted. He did not like, even less, to be thwarted by a woman barely older than his own daughter. Vance turned and went back inside his bank, to his ledgers and his schemes. But the image of Margaret Holbrook, that small, determined figure driving Solomon, her brown horse, up into the hills, remained fixed in his mind like a splinter he could not quite draw out. It was not always this way for Margaret. There had been a time when her life had followed the ordinary trajectory of frontier girls, a childhood of chores and schooling by correspondence, a young womanhood of dancing at town socials and receiving cautious attentions from young men whose fathers owned land. Her mother, Frances, had been a gentle soul, a believer in education and the possibilities of a girl who could read well and cipher correctly. Her father, Henry, had been a man of practical gifts, a self-taught engineer of sorts, fascinated by the problems of water and stone and survival in this unforgiving country. Together, they had given Margaret a peculiar inheritance, a mind inclined toward problem-solving and a heart inclined toward independence. But in the spring of 1879, when Margaret was barely 19, scarlet fever had come to the valley. It took Frances first, then took most of what came after. Henry, grief-stricken and diminished, had clung to the cabin and the land as if either might anchor him to the life he had lost. Margaret, having nursed her mother through the fever and buried her in the small plot behind the cabin, had made a decision that scandalized the town. She had announced she was taking work as a governess in Denver with a respectable widow woman whose son required education. Her father had not stopped her. Perhaps he understood that staying would only deepen the wound. She had spent 5 years in Denver, raising another woman's child, reading every book in the widow's extensive library, and learning the practical business of household management. She had learned, too, how to keep accounts, how to negotiate with tradesmen, how to observe people and understand what they wanted before they knew it themselves. But she had also learned that the city, for all its lights and culture, was a prison of a different kind. And she had come home to her father in the spring of 1884, determined to help him manage the property, to preserve it against the creditors who circled like crows. She had arrived 2 months too late. He had died in early summer, pneumonia settling into his chest after a cold spring rain. The property went to her. At least, that was what she believed, until Clarence Vance had come calling with his papers. The law, as Vance explained it, was complex. Her father had indeed owed money, substantial money, taken against the land as security. Vance held the note. The debt had not been forgiven upon Henry's death. It had passed to Margaret. The numbers were staggering, figures that would take a lifetime of honest labor to repay. Vance had not been unkind in his explanation. He had been almost avuncular, suggesting that perhaps the kindest thing would be for her to accept a fair price for the land and start fresh somewhere else, somewhere more suited to a woman of her accomplishments and education. He had presented this as a mercy. But standing in her father's cabin, Margaret had felt something crystallize inside her. Not rage exactly, though there was rage beneath it. Rather, a clarity, a sense that this moment was one of the hinge points upon which a life turns. She could accept Vance's offer and become what the world expected her to be, a woman dependent upon others' charity, diminished, safe. Or she could refuse, and in refusing, claim the only sovereignty left to her, the right to fail on her own terms. She had chosen to refuse. That night, with her father's notebook spread before her by lamplight, Margaret had read through his observations and sketches, accumulated over years. He had been obsessed with the cave system to the north, with the constant temperature maintained within the earth, with the possibilities it presented. He had written about salt preservation, about the way the ancients had kept meat through impossible winters, about the properties of minerals and cold and time. He had never acted on these ideas. His life had been too consumed with other struggles. But his daughter had read his words as a map. By August of 1884, Margaret had visited the cave system thoroughly. She had measured it, she had understood it, and she had begun to form a plan that was audacious, detailed, and grounded entirely in principles her father had set down on yellowed paper years before. And she had taken her father's savings, a modest amount, but hers alone, and approached the supply agent about obtaining raw salt. She had hired a local boy named Thomas to help with construction, and she had spent the remainder of summer and autumn creating something that no frontier woman had any business creating, and something that no sensible man would have believed she could create at all. The cave itself was located roughly 3 miles northeast of the cabin, up a steep climb through mixed pine and aspen. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for a loaded pack animal, and most of the townsfolk had ignored it, assuming it to be merely another worthless geological curiosity in a country full of them. But Margaret and her father's notes knew better. 30 feet into the mountain, the passage opened into a large chamber, roughly 25 feet wide and 16 feet high, with a smooth floor of compacted earth and stone. The temperature within remained constant at approximately 51 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. The humidity was stable, between 40 and 50%. It was, in short, a nearly perfect natural refrigerator, waiting only for someone with the knowledge and nerve to use it. Margaret's improvement to the space had been conducted with military precision. Working alongside Solomon, who carried the heavy salt bags up the narrow trail, 200 bags in total, weighing approximately 2 pounds each, 400 pounds of pure salt that she had purchased at tremendous expense. Margaret had created a series of shelving units using lumber from the local mill. The shelves were built according to careful specifications. 3 feet deep, a set 18 inches apart, constructed from untreated wood that would not impart flavor or chemical contamination to the meat it would hold. The salt itself, once delivered to the cave, had been spread in a layer 3 inches thick across the cave floor, creating a floor of mineral crystal that would draw moisture from anything placed above it. Then Margaret had constructed the system her father had described. Layers of salt, then layers of meat. Venison, elk, fish from the creek, arranged in careful ratios, each layer separated by cloth soaked in brine to prevent direct contact between flesh and the mineral bed. The temperature never fluctuated enough to compromise the process. The humidity was stable enough to prevent spoilage from damp. The darkness was absolute, protecting the meat from oxidation. The mathematics of preservation worked perfectly. But the mathematics alone would not be sufficient if there were no meat to preserve. This was where Margaret had been clever, in a way that suggested her intelligence had depths that most people, certainly including Clarence Vance, had not suspected. She had approached the hunters who regularly killed elk in the mountains, men who were accustomed to taking only what they could carry, wasting the rest of the carcass. She had offered them a proposition. For every elk that was butchered according to her specifications and delivered to the cave, she would pay them $1.50, and she would preserve the meat in her cave system through the winter. In the spring, when the trading season began again, she would sell the preserved meat at a substantial premium, not to the struggling local populace, but to the mining operations in the territory to the east and to the logging camps in the mountains. These were operations with real money, with constant demand for preserved proteins that could withstand transport. The hunters had laughed at first, a slip of a girl managing a business, but 3 of them had come to look at her system, had seen the engineering of it, had understood that she was serious. By September, she had contracts. By October, she had more elk meat delivered to her cave than she could initially process. Solomon, in addition to carrying supplies, had also become essential for the hauling work, dragging slaughtered elk carcasses up the mountainside, standing patiently while Margaret worked her careful butchery and preservation process. The horse had learned the trail so well that he could navigate it in near darkness, his hooves finding purchase on loose stone with the precision of long practice. Work had consumed her completely. She would leave the cabin before dawn, riding Solomon in the pre-dawn gray, carrying her tools and salt and cloth. She would work through the day in the eternal twilight of the cave, arranging meat, rotating older stock, recording everything in a ledger that her father would have recognized as the work of an engineer. She would return in darkness, exhausted, and spend 2 hours with her accounts, recording transactions, calculating margins, planning for expansion. She had no time for town gossip, no time for the looks that followed her through the markets, no time for Clarence Vance's occasional attempts to approach her. He had tried twice to speak with her on the street, and both times she had nodded politely and walked on, as though he were merely another person whose needs had no bearing on her own. This was perhaps the thing that enraged Vance more than any other. Not that she was defying him. Defiance he could understand, could work against, could ultimately defeat through patience and the slow machinery of the law. What enraged him was her absolute indifference to him. He was a man accustomed to being feared, or at least acknowledged, as a center around which other lives organized themselves. She moved through her days as though he did not exist. But in the second week of November, 1884, the weather changed. Storms moved in from the northwest, bringing snow that did not melt, bringing temperatures that dropped precipitously. The Teton River, which ran at the eastern edge of the valley, had already begun to slow. By the 21st of November, the coldest November that the old-timers in the valley could remember, the river had frozen solid. Not in patches, not in ice that would fracture under pressure, but completely, utterly frozen, a solid barrier of ice that choked the pass and made travel from the valley to the eastern territories virtually impossible. The storm that caused the freezing came on suddenly, arriving from the west on the evening of the 21st, and driving snow sideways until visibility was perhaps 10 feet. It lasted for 4 days. During those 4 days, the supply line that typically brought meat and preserved goods from the ranches to the south was cut off. The hunters who ranged through the mountains could not work. The trading parties who moved between settlements could not move. The valley became an island, isolated, self-contained, and wholly dependent upon whatever stores of food it had accumulated before the snows came. And for the first time since arriving back in the valley, Margaret Holbrook became the most important person in it. The supply agent came to her cabin on the morning of the 24th, his horse nearly as exhausted as he was. He had been dispatched by the town council, a gesture that would have been almost amusing had the circumstances not been so dire. The school had used up its stores. The boarding house could no longer feed its residents. 3 families had children who were going hungry. The mining operation 2 valleys over had sent a message requesting supplies, or they would have to shut down operations. The town was facing a crisis born of unexpected weather, and the simple fact that they had never invested in preservation systems of their own. The supply agent knew about her cave. Half the town knew, in the way that frontier towns know such things. Bits of gossip, pieces of observation, a general sense that something was happening out there on Holbrook land. But he did not know the extent of it. He barely believed it when Margaret showed him the cave, when he walked into the earth and saw the shelves, the organized rotation of curing meat, the careful temperature maintenance, the quantities, hundreds of pounds of elk, venison, fish, packed in salt, enough to sustain the valley for months. Margaret had not celebrated this revelation. She had simply asked him what price the town was offering, and when he hesitated, she had set her own price. Not usurious, she was not Clarence Vance, but adequate to her purposes. $3 per pound for the elk, $2 per pound for the venison, $1 per pound for the fish. The supply agent had agreed immediately, knowing they had no leverage, knowing she had them utterly in her hands. And then, on the morning of the 26th, Clarence Vance himself had appeared at her cabin door. He had knocked, a civilized thing, and when she had answered, he had removed his hat and stood there in the cold, his face flushed with something that might have been embarrassment, or anger, or the simple intensity of humiliation. The bank, he had said, required preserved meat for its operations. The town council had asked her to supply him, not wishing to offend one of the valley's principal businessmen. Could she provide him with 200 pounds of venison to be delivered within the week? She could have refused. She could have told him no, could have exacted whatever price she wished, could have used this moment to wring some concession from him regarding her debt. She could have gloated. She could have been vengeful. Instead, she had listened to his request, and she had nodded, and she had told him the price was the same as for everyone else, $3 per pound. 200 pounds would cost him $600, which was a considerable sum, but which she would be happy to provide. Vance had stood there in the snow, and something in his face had shifted. Not acceptance exactly, but the acknowledgement of circumstance. He had agreed to the terms. He had turned to leave, and then he had paused, and he had asked her a question, and not how she had done this. The engineering of it was beyond him, or perhaps he simply did not wish to acknowledge that she possessed such capabilities. But how she had known to do it, why she had invested in this when everything else she might have done would have been simpler. Margaret had considered the question, standing in her doorway in her mother's old wool coat, and her father's logic still fresh in her mind. And she had told him the truth, that her father had imagined it, that she had merely listened to his imagining and had done the work to bring it into being, that the frontier was not kind to dreams, and so one had to build the thing that the frontier could not take from you. Vance had left then, moving down the snow-covered path with Solomon picking his way carefully behind him, in carrying the first of the venison that would feed his bank and his town through the darkest months of the year. And Margaret had gone back inside, and she had continued with her work. The winter of 1884 passed into history, remarkable for its severity, for the isolation it imposed, and for the quiet miracle of a woman who had built a system from mathematics and salt and determination. The debt that Clarence Vance held over her property went unpaid, but Vance never again mentioned it. Something had shifted in him, perhaps a recognition that some people could not be defeated by the normal instruments of defeat. Or perhaps he had simply understood that she was no longer a vulnerable widow against whom he could leverage financial pressure. She was a woman with a trade, with reliable income, with a system that worked. She was, in short, no longer dependent upon his mercy. In the spring of 1885, the pass opened again, and the normal supply lines resumed. But the mining operations to the east continued to request her preserved meat, finding it superior to anything that could be procured through the conventional channels. She expanded her operation, bringing in more hunters, creating additional cave systems in the limestone. By 1888, she had established a reputation as the finest preserver of meat in the territory. People knew her name. They came to her. The girl whom Vance had intended to erase from the landscape had instead become indispensable to it. She never married. The opportunities were there. Men came from the neighboring territories, drawn by her success and her intelligence, and the independence that came from having built something entirely her own. But she had seen what marriage had done to her mother, the way her ambitions had been slowly consumed by the ambitions of others. She had chosen instead a different path, the path of the woman who owns herself, who answers to no one, who has built something that will outlast her. When she died in 1893, Of pneumonia, not unlike the illness that had taken her father, the territorial government had erected a stone marker near the entrance to her cave system. It read simply, Margaret Elise Holbrook, 1860 to 1893. She built with her hands and her mind. What others said could not be built. The frontier was not kind, but she was kind still. It was not a grand epitaph, but it was an honest one. And perhaps, in the end, that was all anyone could ask. If Wild West Retribution has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Just a couple dollars a month keeps these stories coming. Links below, and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already.